Okay, the recording has started. So again, hello, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the April 2024 edition of our NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar. We hold these webinars to support agricultural producers, so farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, our conservation partners, and also our research partners in findings to support voluntary conservation efforts across the nation. My name is Elizabeth Creech-Thomas, and I'm a Natural Resources Communication Specialist with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. We'll get started with today's presentation in just a few moments, but first, I want to share a few logistics. So if you're interested in directly learning about upcoming conservation outcomes webinars or findings from our Conservation Effects Assessment Project, you can subscribe to receive emails directly in your inbox. And we will share a direct link to subscribe in the meeting chat. You can also access that link by visiting our webpage. And you're going to hear me say this URL several times today. So this will be in the meeting chat as well. The URL is nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. And just so you know, you'll have an option to subscribe to multiple mailing lists. The one you're looking for us is called Conservation Outcomes, and it's housed under Conservation. I also want to cover a few FAQs. So these are common questions we get during these webinars. The first question, can I access live captioning? The answer is absolutely yes. So if you look in the top right corner of your Teams, you will see an option to click 3 dots that say more. If you click that, there is language and speech. And then with that, you can access captions. Another question is, can I ask questions? The answer to that is also yes. Please do ask questions. So please type your questions or add them to our meeting chat throughout the event. You don't have to wait till the end. You can add them as soon as you think of them, and then we will address those at the end during a Q&A session. And also, if we don't have time to address all questions or you think of something after the fact, you can email me directly at elizabeth.creech-thomas@usda.gov. My email address will also be in the meeting chat. And then the final question, how do I access presentation slides, additional resources, and the webinar recording? And the answer to that is we will make sure all of these things are available to you on that website. So I won't say the URL again, but it will be available via the chat, our Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage. And there right now, you'll see a one-pager that you can access. And we will make sure that the recording of this, along with our presenter slides, is available by early May. So with that, it's time to get started. I'm thrilled to welcome Mr. Ben Malone. He's our Acting Associate Deputy Chief for the NRCS Soil Science and Resource Assessment Deputy Area. Mr. Malone, thank you so much for joining us today. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I just wanted to forewarn everyone, I am dealing with a lingering sinus infection. So if my voice gets a little cracky or shaky, that's the reason. But once again, hello, everyone, and welcome to the April 2024 edition of our Conservation Outcomes webinar series. Thank you all for joining us today. At USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, one of our driving missions is working with farmers, ranchers, and other agricultural producers to strengthen their operations and conserve natural resources through voluntary efforts. And as USDA's primary private lands conservation agency, we generate, manage, and share the data, technology, and standards that enable landowners and our many conservation partners to make decisions informed by objective, reliable science. USDA's Conservation Effects Assessment Project, or otherwise known as CEAP, is a multi-agency effort led by the Natural Resources Conservation Service to quantify the effects of conservation outcomes and support data-driven conservation decision-making across the nation's working lands. CEAP works closely with our science partners and other federal agencies and members of academia, such as today's presenters, to identify and address key knowledge gaps. Findings from these collaborative efforts inform improved conservation delivery for NRCS and strengthened management decisions across working lands nationwide. Our Conservation Outcomes webinar series enables us to directly communicate with you, our conservation and research partners and colleagues, agricultural producers, and other private landowners and land managers, the documented outcomes associated with this work. Today's webinar will help answer a question of interest for many farmers and conservationists alike. We know cover crops may deliver many benefits to soil health and water quality, but what about wildlife? Specifically, can cover crops contribute to conservation of grassland birds, a group experiencing a widespread population decline? I'm currently on detail at headquarters, but my permanent position with NRCS is state conservationist for Alabama. In that role, I'm proud of the work that I've seen on the ground led by landowners and supported by NRCS and our partners to deliver conservation solutions that strengthen working lands while conserving key wildlife species. Today's conservation outcomes webinar will provide new findings to support on-the-ground cropland management decisions informed by a better understanding of the potential role of cover crops in grassland bird conservation. Thank you again for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Charlie Rewa, our SEEP Wildlife Lead, to introduce our guest presenters. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ben. Again, I'm Charlie Rewa, NRCS Lead for the SEEP Wildlife Assessments. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We're very excited to share some outcomes, findings, and insights generated from our SEEP science partners at Iowa State University, South Dakota State University, and the University of Tennessee from their work evaluating bird use of cover crops in Iowa and Tennessee. Since 2005, we've conducted over 100 SEEP wildlife outcome-based assessments through cooperative agreements with our science partners at universities, NGOs, and other federal agencies. Assessment findings, reports, and other documents from this work can be found on the SEEP website included in today's links. So SEEP Wildlife works closely with NRCS biology discipline leads and experts to identify priority assessment topics. And about 5 or 6 years ago, as NRCS and producers were expanding adoption of the cover crop practice on working croplands, we started getting questions regarding the value of this practice, positive or negative, for grassland birds. So we partnered with science experts at the 3 universities I mentioned to assess the value of cover crops in a couple of agriculture production regions. Iowa, sort of representing the Corn Belt, and Tennessee, representing the Mid-South or Cotton Belt, to help fill this information gap. So today's webinar features Dr. Adam Janke from Iowa State University, who will discuss findings from Iowa, and Dr. David Buehler from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, who will present the findings from Tennessee. The work sheds light on what we can expect from cover crops in terms of their role in grassland bird conservation in these featured agricultural landscapes. So with that, now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Adam Janke to start the main webinar presentation, and I'll be back at the end for the Q&A session. So Adam, the mic is yours, and we're ready for your screen share. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Charlie, and thanks everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you and talking about this important topic that we've been, as Charlie mentioned, talking about and curious about for a number of years here in the Corn Belt. I'm going to kick the presentation off today, talk first just sort of about what cover crops are, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, what cover crops do in agricultural landscapes, and then we're going to talk about the specific findings of those 2 research studies that Charlie mentioned. I'm going to talk specifically about what we found in Iowa in a collaborative project with farmers and landowners in southeastern Iowa, where we had researchers from both Iowa State University and South Dakota State University doing some monitoring on breeding birds. And then Dr. Buehler from the University of Tennessee will talk about their work with both breeding and non-breeding birds in western and central Tennessee, as you'll see. So first, I just want to get started with this question that frames, of course, today's conversation is, what is a cover crop? We want to make sure that we're all on the same page on this important definition. And so what I did is I just pulled right from NRCS's conservation practice standard definition of a cover crop. A cover crop is a growing crop of grasses, small grains, or legumes, primarily for seasonal protection and soil improvement. And what's important here is to remember that cover crops are not cash crops. And that's an important distinction. Sometimes in some parts of the country, maybe we think cover crops just become synonymous with anything growing on the soil. But we know, of course, cash crops like wheat or other winter hardy grains can cover the soil during the winter, but be a cash crop, and they're managed differently in important ways. So we want to focus today's conversations on cover crops, meaning sort of the opposite of a cash crop, something grown between those. To sort of contextualize what that looks like across the country, I wanted to sort of start with just a picture here where the cash crops are shown in gold and the cover crops are shown in blue. Each of these are examples of cover cropping systems that, in this case, there's actually been wildlife research on, and that's why I'm featuring them. But that places where you may hear the word cover crop used, that it's used in very different ways. So here in the Corn Belt in Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, cover crops are often squeezed between corn and soybean rotations. So they grow during the late fall and early spring, and then are killed in some way ahead of or immediately after the planting of the cash crop. There's a study that I'll talk about in a few slides from Western Kansas where it's a prolonged crop rotation, so that something like corn or soybean is grown during one growing season, and then there's a long period of fallow ahead of a winter wheat rotation. And the traditional practice would be to just allow the fields to fallow during that time, and integration of cover crops in those systems might mean planting cover crops in the spring and terminating them before that late summer planting, like shown in the middle there. And then cover crops are even used in perennial cropping systems like vineyards in California, where there's been some work on pollinator use of mixtures of flowers integrated into those perennial cropping systems. So I wanted to say this to just remind everybody that cover crops mean really different things in really different geographies. And so you're going to hear me and Dr. Buehler today talk about how it's important to only consider the implications of our work for the relatively restricted geography in which we worked. Even within a restricted geography, we can find a lot of variation in the way cover crops are applied that could also have potential to impact or to affect their secondary benefits, like benefits to wildlife, like we're talking about today. And so that's what I've tried to capture here on this slide. And I won't go through every single one of these because I'm not the agronomist on the call, but we know that things like growing conditions, whether it's growing during the winter or during the summer, will have an impact on the impacts of cover crops. The species and mixes of the cover crops themselves are important. The cash cropping system and what's grown before or after the cover crops can have an impact on how they're used. How the cover crops are terminated ahead of the cash crop can be important. The timing of that termination can be important. And then finally, there's lots of interest, at least here in the Corn Belt, about livestock integration, basically grazing in cover crops, and that can also have an impact on the associated environmental benefits that cover crops have. So that is a whole semester class you could take on potential cover crops, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page for understanding all this nuance. When we say cover crop, it can mean really different things depending on these factors and the geography where the cover crop is used. So what do cover crops do? Well, I can speak at least to the cover cropping system that's common across the upper Midwest, where my work was done. For this, we have a really nice study published in 2018 in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation that sort of accounted for many of the ecological impacts of cover crop. And what are shown here are sort of hypothetical relationships between the benefits shown on the right and the biomass of the cover crop integrated into a primarily corn and soybean cropping system, typical of the north central United States. And you can see that there's lots of benefits associated often with increasing biomass for things like water. So, for example, preventing erosion and sediment deposition into waterways, or the enrichment of nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus bound to sediment. There's also benefits to soil itself, like preventing soil erosion or retaining nutrients, or also building soil carbon or even trafficability of the soil. And then finally, there's agronomic benefits, things like weed suppression, building soil carbon, keeping soil on the farm, and then also impacts on the subsequent cash crops. And so what I wanted to point out here is that cover crops have a broad portfolio of benefits that are important, but one thing that wasn't considered in this study necessarily was the impacts on wildlife. And it's something that we're trying to build an understanding of now that cover crops have become more common in our agricultural landscapes. So I'm a wildlife ecologist, and I study where birds live on farms and how farmers can help birds thrive in agricultural landscapes. And the way a wildlife ecologist like me thinks about wildlife impacts of any land use decision or any cropping practice is we have to sort of answer two important questions. The first question is, do the animals use it? In this case, do the animals use cover crops for some element of their habitat? And so would they find food there, shelter there, or water associated with, in this case, cover crops? And would they be arranged in space in a way that promotes the thriving of the animal? That would be the first question, is do animals even take advantage of it? The next question that's also important that wildlife ecologists always ask is, do the animals essentially thrive there? Can their use, for example, of cover crops promote their survival or promote their reproduction? And ultimately, most importantly, can it release constraints on their population, assuming we want to increase their population like we do with grassland breeding birds, so that their populations can perhaps increase through time because of the use, for example, of cover crops? So that's how a wildlife ecologist thinks about that. And I think one way to sort of contextualize this and start to talk about what we know about cover crops is to think about those two boxes as two different axes. So first, I'll talk about an axis of use, ranging from no use on the left to extensive use on the right. And there's a little bit of research on cover crop use by grassland breeding birds or migratory birds. And this is one example of one such study from Illinois. And they were looking at a corn and soybean cropping system and looking at how different species of grassland birds use cover crops. They found, for example, Henslow sparrows were basically completely absent from cover crop fields. So we would say they kind of don't check that first litmus, that first question of whether or not they use the practice. It's unlikely that Henslow sparrows will benefit from the integration of cover crops into cropping systems. But that study in Illinois did find that eastern meadowlarks, a declining species of grassland breeding bird common throughout the Corn Belt, did use cover crop fields. They were finding them fairly consistently. So the next question that wasn't initially addressed in that Illinois initial study, but could be in subsequent studies, is, do the meadowlarks then benefit from their use? And so that's where we go to that second box that I was talking about, or in this case, a second axis, the impact axis. So if, for example, eastern meadowlarks were using cover crops and benefiting from cover crops, we'd put them high on this second axis, or if they were negatively impacted, we would put them low. Here we can go to some other studies on cover crop use among wildlife to sort of show what this looks like in space. So there was a nice study in that cropping system that I mentioned in Kansas, where they have corn or soybean and then a long period of fallow replaced by a cover crop, and then a winter hardy grain planted after the termination of the cover crop. And researchers in Kansas just recently published this paper that said pheasants were really taking advantage of those cover crop fields to rear their young and survive throughout the winter. And so we would say this is a positive impact. The pheasants were using it, and they were positively impacted by cover crops in that cropping system. There's also a really nice study that was published last year out of South Dakota that looked at the same question for breeding ducks. And so they found that ducks were using cover crop fields in a corn and soybean rotation extensively, but their use of those fields exposed them to the equipment that was associated with the cash cropping system and led to widespread nest failure. And so it was a negative impact. So a wildlife ecologist would look at this and say, in some cases, use may be entirely inconsequential. Some cases, use may be positive, may benefit the species. In some cases, it may be negative, and we would call that an ecological trap, something that the animal thinks looks good, but we find doesn't actually support their persistence. And so we went into this study wondering how cover crops, in our case in Iowa, and in Tennessee's case in Tennessee, benefited or impact grassland birds in various ways. So now I'm going to talk about what we learned in Iowa. And before I do that, I should acknowledge the graduate students that did all of the work. They're pictured here on the left. Taylor was then Shirley, now Ballard, and Megan or Maggie Figura, who was advised by Dr. Josh Stafford at South Dakota State University. Lots of research technicians were involved in this project, and of course, we couldn't have done it without the gracious permission of dozens of landowners in southeastern Iowa that put up with, among other things, weird instrumentation out in the field like this at the time of planting. Just very briefly, you've heard me talk about our cover cropping system in Iowa, but this was a corn and soybean rotation. We were exclusively working in cereal rye fields, which is the most common practice around here. The cover crops were terminated with herbicide, and there was no livestock integration in our study. We were working in southeastern Iowa, that county shown in green here, where there's widespread row crop production and also widespread adoption of cover crops in the state. This is a part of our state that there's been a sort of a history of progressive conservation adoption, and the same is true for cover crops. We see the most cover crops in this part of the state. 14 to 20% of row crop acres had some visible cover crop based on some roadside surveys that we did during our study. We worked on dozens of different landowners and gained access to over 6,000 acres of row crop field and 2,700 acres of grasslands enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, where we measured 3 different outcomes related to breeding birds. First, we did bird point count surveys, which I'll talk more about. That was what the South Dakota crew did. And then we also did some pheasant roadside surveys to evaluate landscape level responses of pheasants to cover crop integration in the county. And then we did a pheasant nesting survey with intensive searches in the cover crop fields for evidence of pheasant reproduction, or the impact axis, essentially, for pheasants. Pheasants in this case just became a nice substitute for understanding grassland bird use, and they're a species that is of concern both economically and socially in our study area. First, I'll talk about the bird point count part of the study. So the crew from South Dakota did surveys from May 1st to July 31st. They did these in cover crop fields, row crop fields, and grasslands. They were searching these fields and recording all birds that were seen in and around the fields during their standardized search efforts. What's shown in this figure is the abundance of birds in the different field types, with cover crops, row crop fields without cover crops, and perennial or grassland fields. Along the x-axis, the figure on the left is the abundance or total number of birds counted in those fields, and the figure on the right is the number of unique bird species. And then the 2 different colors of the points are all bird species are the top points, and species of conservation concern, a subset of all of those birds that we're concerned about, are the orange points. And what you can see here is that there were more birds and more diversity of birds using the grassland fields, and bird use in cover crop and row crop fields was pretty similar. What I've done here is I've taken a look, we've compared the grassland breeding birds based on their density, birds per field, in grassland or perennial practices in green, cover crop fields in blue, and row crop fields in gold. And we can look at the species that used these different field types. First, there were only 3 species of birds that use crop fields proportionally more than grasslands. That was dick thistles, horned larks, and upland sandpipers. Of these 2, horned larks and upland sandpipers are known to nest in crop fields, and dick thistles are just relatively ubiquitous, and it probably has more to do with a response to what was going around the field, what was going on around the fields. But within row crop fields, there was these species outlined in black are those that had greater relative abundance in cover crop fields than they did in row crop fields, which suggests that these grassland breeding birds are showing some sort of response to the presence of cover crops, likely perhaps a foraging response, much like what was found in that Illinois study. So it shows relatively limited use, but a response to the integration of the cover crops. The takeaway from this portion of the study is that there was diverse bird use around these cover crop fields, but generally the cover crop fields were more aligned with row crop conditions than they were with mimicking grassland ecosystems or grassland habitat for the birds, and thus probably not having substantial impact for the community of breeding birds in the region. Our next question is about pheasant roadside surveys. We were using roadside surveys as a way to sort of evaluate the potential for pheasants to have population level responses to the integration of cover crops in this county with really high cover crop adoption. So what you see here is Washington County, and those black lines are the roads that we drove to do surveys for crowing pheasants, and then later in the year to look for pheasant broods. We also mapped the cover crops along all of those roadsides so that we could go back later and try to estimate statistically the impact of cover crop use on crowing pheasant abundance or on brood abundance. We will look at this with a few plots from our statistical models. So what we have here on the x-axis or the bottom is the percent of fields in cover crops. So this would be the percent of, for example, a soybean field in cover crops when we drove by it. And on the y-axis or the vertical axis, the number of pheasants observed at a point next to those fields. So we would think if cover crops were really positively impacting pheasants, like crowing pheasants thought they needed to be around cover crop fields, that we would see this positive relationship. And if pheasants didn't care about cover crop fields, they would just be randomly distributed relative to those fields and the use of cover crops, and we would expect it to be a flat line like this. And what we found, as you can see, is much more similar to the flat line. It seemed crowing males were not responding to the integration of cover crops across Washington County. We did the exact same thing and would expect the exact same pattern with the probability of seeing a brood next to a soybean or next to a cornfield relative to the amount of that field that was in, or those fields that were in cover crops. And here again, we find the same pattern, flat response, basically suggesting that there weren't necessarily more broods in landscapes where there was more cover crop adoption. So our takeaway from the pheasant roadside surveys is that current adoption rates in the study area, they had no impact on pheasant abundance or pheasant productivity as measured from those roadside surveys. Okay, our last methodology was to go out and search for pheasant nests out in the field. So we sent technicians out to search 1 acre plots, randomly placed across the fields and stratified by 3 different types of grasslands. So on the left are those of ecosystems. On the left are the types of fields that we searched: native warm season grasses, cool season grasses like smooth brome primarily, and fall seeded cover crops. You can see we searched in 23 different fields of cover crops and 166 acres of plots, basically. And the figure on the right just shows what one of those cover crop fields looked like. We went to those points that were randomly placed in the field and conducted our searches looking for evidence of nesting pheasants. And this is what we found. We found in the native warm season grass fields, like basically a typical CRP field, we found 28 nests in 114 plots. In cool season grass like brome, we found 1 nest in 85 plots. And in cover crop fields, we found 2 nests in 166 plots. So if we converted those estimates to densities, we found 1 nest for every 4 acres of native warm season grasses, 1 nest for every 84 acres of cover crops, and 1 nest for every 85 acres of fields like smooth brome. We analyzed the characteristics of all the nests that we found in our study and found that pheasants were really selecting for areas that had a lot of litter cover, or basically last year's plant material, at the point. And if there wasn't very much plant material from which they would build their nests, the pheasants seem to be avoiding those sites. And that's one challenge that cover crop fields present. The other thing is that pheasants were really selecting for dense vegetation at their nest sites. And so we would need to see high biomass of cover crops or high growth of cover crops in order for pheasants to use it. And we just weren't seeing that in very many of our fields. And that's what's depicted by this slide. We ended up stumbling into 2 other pheasant nests and cover crop fields while we were transiting between our plots. And so we have a total of 4 nests and cover crop fields to sort of understand how pheasants were using cover crops. And every single one of these had high growth of cover crops going into soybeans. So they were building their nests, as you can see, with the residue from the last year's corn crop, and then had high concealment from the growth of the cover crop in the soybean field in that year. None of these nests were successful, but we didn't document any of them being destroyed by farm equipment. But that's actually the last point that I want to make, is that that's going to be a real challenge with pheasant nesting and cover crops, is just the timing of nesting. So what's depicted on the left are all the studies that we could find from the Midwest, Wisconsin, Iowa, South Dakota, and our own study that show nest initiation by pheasants. And what I've drawn here in this dashed line is the same date range on the figure on the right that shows typical corn planting dates in Iowa. And taken all together, it suggests that there's going to be low densities of pheasant nests in crop fields and a high potential for conflict with those nests and cropping practices used there. Now, this is the exact same material that I've been showing you as I go, but just to recap, we saw low bird use of cover crop fields, and the bird use that we saw was more similar to conventional cropping systems. We didn't see any evidence of like a landscape level impact on pheasant distribution, abundance, or productivity associated with cover crop adoption. And we see very little nesting actually in the crop fields, really low densities. And it seems unlikely that even those that are nesting in cover crop fields would survive. And so if we go back to this axis, this question that I asked about how wildlife may be impacted by cover crops in this cropping system as currently implemented, we would say it seems like most grassland breeding birds in Iowa will have really low use. They just don't seem to be taking advantage of these cover crop fields in the aggregate, and we don't really know what the impact would be. There may be some winners like upland sandpipers and some losers, perhaps like meadowlarks, but that would need to be the source of additional research. And then finally, our indications are that pheasants really just aren't using these cover crop fields very much, but when they are, it may have slight negative impacts, but not something that I'm necessarily thinking or worried too much about. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Buehler so you can learn about the work that he's done in Tennessee.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So Adam has actually done a great job on kind of setting the conceptual framework for both these studies. So I'm going to focus specifically on the Tennessee work on the results of our study, the objective, methods, results, and then draw some conclusions and management implications. I too have to acknowledge my graduate student, Brittany Panos, in the study. She did a great job on carrying this from actually the COVID year in 2020 all the way through completion. And she's now a biologist with Atlantic Audubon in the Chesapeake Bay area. And I'd also like to acknowledge NRCS and the SEEP project for the funding, and the Tennessee NRCS biologists and district conservationists were great to work with and really helped us identify willing landowners to work on. And of course, the University of Tennessee School of Natural Resources has provided my support. And also, I'd like to acknowledge all the private landowners who allowed us access to their properties. So Tennessee is a little bit different. We're actually looking at cover crops in crop types, including a lot of corn and soybeans, but also cotton. And in Tennessee, the actual crop species planted were typically a 5-species grass forb mix, which included crimson clover, hairy vetch, Austrian winter pea, daikon radish, triticale, and winter wheat. So kind of different than the single species that Iowa typically uses. And of course, the landscape context is different in Tennessee. In our agricultural production areas that we studied, they were typically about 50% forest cover and 50% agricultural. And so that's a little bit different. And then, of course, our climate is also different. We've got a longer growing season and a much shorter dormant season. And we generally have very little snow cover during winter. So that has huge implications for how cover crops develop and how they persist through the winter and how they recover during the spring. And then finally, the cover crop practice is the largest conservation practice in Tennessee with over 100,000 acres enrolled annually. And this may not look like that much in terms of total acres in conservation practices compared to some areas in the Midwest, but for Tennessee, this is really significant. And finally, we're trying to look at avian use. We were unable to really go much further than that on Adams' scale of wildlife values, but we looked at it seasonally, so we could look at it in the winter, during the migration period, and during the breeding season. So we documented establishment and termination of the cover crop practice and the vegetation characteristics that came about. And we documented avian use of these fields during the 3 primary periods. And then we also looked at nesting activity in cover crops as a measure of ultimate value. And here's the state of Tennessee. And we had 2 counties in the middle of the state and 3 counties along the Mississippi River. These were 5 of the counties that had some of the highest adoption rates for this practice, and so had a lot of fields available for study. And in each county, we typically had 20 cover crop fields and 10 non-cover crop fields. So we had 40 in Middle Tennessee and 40 along the Mississippi River of each type. And these fields were generally managed the same in the sense that other than the planting of cover crop, they typically had no-till planting methods, and they typically had burned down herbicides at the end of the spring period prior to planting. So the only main difference was that the cover crop fields had cover crop species planted in the fall. And then in terms of our monitoring, we looked at our bird monitoring involved line transects, and each field we would place 2 100-meter line transects, and we visited each field 6 times during the year. We also did point intercept vegetation surveys where we would put a tape measure along the line transects and at every 1-meter point document the vegetation that was present there. And then we also did breeding bird activity surveys in which we looked for nests, and we also looked for other associated bird behaviors that were associated with nesting. In terms of the veg analysis, we used 2-way analysis of variance, and the key parameters we measured were average height of the vegetation, percent cover, percent bare ground, and then the vertical and horizontal variance of those metrics that tried to capture patchiness. And of course, we did extensive bird monitoring, and we documented species accumulations, which was the total number of species detected in a given field type. We also did occupancy models, where occupancy was the probability of a given species would be present in a given field. And we had 14 focal species shown in orange there on the right, where we had sufficient data to be able to do occupancy models. Then we also did species richness, which is just the number of species detected per field, and then conservation value models, which involved the cumulative conservation score from partners in flight, individual species scores. And in the conservation value, each species has a conservation value score. And if you take all the species that are present and you sum all of their scores, that represents the conservation value that we analyzed. So to jump into results, establishment in Tennessee typically occurs towards the end of October, from October 20th to October 30th, and it's pretty consistent among years. And then termination occurs actually right exactly now, the third week in April to the end of April, depending on the spring green up and how wet it is during the spring and other associated environmental parameters. In terms of establishment success, we define success as having greater than 75% cover in a given field in cover crop species. And the brown bars here represent 2021 and the green bars represent 2022. The left side represents winter and the right side represents spring. You can see that during winter, we had anywhere from 60 to 80% of our fields were deemed successful in establishment. And then in spring, in both years, it was at 80% or above in terms of having successful establishment of the cover crop. Just a quick bird's eye view of what these fields look like. Here's the Robertson County field in December, and you can see daikon radish and some of those other cover crop plants having well established in the field even in December. Here's another field in Coffee County in January. Here's a nice winter day where we've got full coverage of the field in cover crop species. But of course, when we get winter, it often will last for a week, and this is Lauderdale County in February 2021. And that sets back your cover crops. So this is what Coffee County looked like after that same snow event. And you can, if you look closely, you can still see that there's cover crops present, but they've been knocked back significantly. And then they, as the weather moderates, they grow back pretty rapidly. And then here is kind of the end result at this time of year in April. And this is Coffee County, a really lush grass forb mix that is dominated by cover crops. And when you look at this, you could imagine that breeding birds and breeding grassland birds are going to look at this field and say, this looks pretty darn good. And then, of course, the fields are terminated. And in Tennessee, the corn crop is typically planted around May 1st. And quickly, with establishment of the corn crop, you see a typical cornfield emerging, even by the end of May. So in terms of vegetation height, the left two bars are in winter, and the cover crops had slightly more vegetation height than the non-cover crop fields. But in general, in winter, that cover crop height or the vegetation height is pretty limited to 5 centimeters. But then during spring, you see all the growth, and the cover crop fields start to outpace the non-cover crop fields with over 20 centimeters of vegetation height. In terms of vegetation cover, the same pattern, statistically significant more cover in cover crop fields in the winter and during the spring than in non-cover crop fields. But it's important to note that in both cases, the relative percent of vegetative cover was very high. So we're talking like the difference between 96% versus 95% cover in winter. So both field types had high percentage cover on them, which is good news for water quality considerations. In terms of the bird use, this is a species accumulation curve. And what species accumulation analysis does is it puts the total number of species documented on a scale of the number of visits on the x-axis, so that in our case, where we had more visits in cover crop fields than we did in non-cover crop fields, it puts them on an equal footing. So when you look at the graph, you can see that the trajectory of species accumulations was very similar between cover crops and non-cover crops. And our cover crop fields had a total of 66 species documented in 2022. Our non-cover crop fields had 64 species. So what that suggests is that the total number of species using these two field types was very similar. And I might also point out, this is actually 2022 data. The 2021 data was actually very, very similar to what we saw in 2022. When you look at the most common species present on both field types, you see a lot of overlap. So in terms of year-round residents on these fields, red-winged blackbirds in both cases made up a high percentage of total detections. Field sparrows and meadowlarks were the second and third most common year-round residents in cover crop fields. And European starlings and killdeer were the second and third most common species in non-cover crop fields. But as you go down the page and you look at the different stages, life history stages for these birds, you can see a lot of overlap here in terms of the common species using these fields. In terms of species of conservation concern, in Tennessee, in that part of the state using agricultural fields, the species that we're really interested in include the northern bobwhite and the wild turkey, two upland game birds, and then the loggerhead shrike. And you can see just by looking at the bobwhite data that there are more detections in cover crop fields than in non-cover crop fields, more turkey detections as well. And loggerhead shrikes, neither field type actually was supporting much loggerhead shrike use at all. And then our species occupancy models. The 5 species on the top showed a positive relationship between occupancy and the presence of cover crops. And if you actually looked at the occupancy rates, generally the cover crop fields had about a 10%, 5 to 10% greater occupancy than the non-cover crop fields did. So this was basically a positive impact for these grassland species in terms of occupancy. But it's also important to note that these values are relatively modest. And typically in Tennessee on CRP grasslands, for example, you would see occupancy rates for these species at somewhere around 0.75. So even though there's a significant effect here, the overall effect size is still fairly modest. And then there's a couple of species that don't apparently like cover crop fields, the American robin and the killdeer. Then finally, in terms of richness and conservation score, this is 2022 data again. The species richness in cover crops was significantly greater than in non-cover crops. And again, we're looking at a 10 to 15% impact. And then the cumulative conservation score also was significantly greater in cover crops than in non-cover crops, with about a 10% impact. What about nesting activity? So we documented nesting activity for some species during the breeding season, but this is limited to male territorial singing and adults carrying nesting material. We did not document any successful nests that hatched or food carries to nests that indicate hatching, or the documentation of the presence of fledglings. So in general, in terms of nesting activity, we know some species were involved in nesting, but we documented no successful nesting. So to wrap this up for Tennessee, the implementation of the cover crop program was successful in terms of the producers being able to plant the cover crop and get a cover crop successfully established and growing on those fields. We documented a good diversity of avian species using cover crop fields, and in 2022, we documented 66 different species using it. The bird conservation value was greater in cover crops than in non-cover crops, with about a 10% impact in terms of the benefit. And then the use of cover crops early in the breeding season was common by priority grassland bird species, but successful nesting was not documented. So that brings up a real question of, do you really want to encourage nesting in these fields if termination is timed such that successful nesting is unlikely? We had a discussion with the Tennessee NRCS Technical Committee, and they're actually looking at developing incentives for earlier termination to discourage some of this nesting attempt. Because if you could actually terminate these fields sometime between April 1st and April 15th, you would effectively discourage birds from nesting there, and those birds could go elsewhere and hopefully might have a better outcome. So to put this all back in perspective, this is the axes that Adam presented previously, and breeding bird use, I would say, is kind of over here on the left side of the scale. Relatively limited use, and I put it at being slightly negative because we're encouraging some of these birds to breed when in fact the likelihood of being successful is very low. And then during the non-breeding season, winter and migration, we saw considerable use. And I generally see that as beneficial because the resources that they're finding there seem to be sufficient to keep attracting them and hopefully supporting survival during those periods. And then finally, to wrap up the whole webinar in terms of what we found, you can see all these studies shown on the same two axes. And I guess some of the take-home messages here are that there's regional differences in terms of the benefits that cover crops may provide for birds. And then there's also life stage specific differences in terms of the benefits they may provide. So generally, we were seeing that during the breeding season, the use was relatively limited and the benefits were generally not seen as being positive. But at other times of the year during the non-breeding season, both in pheasants in Kansas and non-breeding birds in Tennessee, we saw considerable use and perceived benefit. So that kind of puts it all into perspective, I think, in terms of how all the research on birds plays out. So with that quick review, I think we're ready for questions, Creech.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Adam. The chat has been somewhat lively, and so there's a few questions that have come in, and I'll just go through a few of those. We have some time for a few of them anyway. So this first one is for Adam. In the Iowa study, it was found that there was not much use of cover crop fields by birds during spring surveys, but was there any evaluation of cover crop field use by birds, especially pheasants, during the summer and fall? Would we see more birds flushing out of the field with cover crops versus fields without cover crops? Or any distinction made of fields using cover crops that were early season interseeded into corn at the V3, V6 timeframe? So
yeah, so a couple of thoughts there. No, you're right that we were just searching for nesting efforts relatively early on in the growing season and not out in these fields, when they were real tall. But that was actually what motivated the brood surveys. Our hypothesis there was that if pheasants were somehow benefiting from cover crop fields, either like nesting in them or using them for brood rearing habitat, that we would detect them more frequently along the roadsides adjacent to those fields, because we know pheasant behavior. They come out to roads in the morning to find grit and also to escape the moisture of the vegetation. And so that was actually what motivated that study. So that is one line of evidence that suggests that there probably aren't additional benefits that we weren't accounting for pheasants, like through the reproductive period. Your question about the timing of planting is a good one. And I think what you're probably getting at there is like basically more opportunity for growth when the cover crop is interseeded into corn late in the growing season. Or the opposite side of that would be like the examples of like planting green with soybeans and terminating cover crops after the planting of the cash crop. We have a hunch that anything that would promote biomass may attract more birds to the field. So like earlier planting would allow for more growing degree days, especially if the rains came, of the cover crop late in the fall, and that would increase biomass and potentially increase the attractiveness of the field. But the challenge becomes, once it becomes attractive to the field, you might have the problem like Dr. Buehler saw in Tennessee, where birds are getting hit by the equipment. And so it's kind of becoming like an ecological trap, or like that work that was done in the Dakotas, where the ducks were settling into those fields and then their nests were failing because of the field operation. So good question. Anything that promotes biomass might attract more birds. We just don't know what the impact would be. And my hunch is that the impact wouldn't be substantial with pheasants. They seem to be selecting for grassland environments.
All right, thanks, Adam. I'll throw this next one to David. Do you believe that Tennessee's utilization of a multiple species cover crop has anything to do with the positive impact compared to Iowa's single species cover crop system? Access to a more diverse habitat.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at our fields, they are lush grass forb legume dominated fields, especially, as you go from February into March and April. And so I do think having that 5 species mix does really kind of help this overall avian use that you see. But then there's the other question about, well, is a mix of species viable in Iowa? And I don't know, Adam, we've had some discussion about that, because here it works, but would that also work there?
Yeah. There was some discussion about, why are you terminating the cover crop instead of harvesting it? And of course, a lot of that is dealing with the standard for cover crop if there's a cost share involved. But I guess one comment was the benefit of a cover crop are decreased by the removal of the biomass, but you get a mulch benefit if you leave it on the field. If you harvest, you increase the passage of equipment on the field, increase compaction and fuel use, and increasing removal of nutrients, which then have to be replaced. And I guess that sort of gets back to the whole purpose of a cover crop. Adam, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, yeah, I think you're talking through the types of things we would think about. And we did actually in our study have a field that was harvested for forage. So it wouldn't, like, I don't know how it's cost shared or whatever. I see that in the discussion. That's separate from what we saw. But yeah, you remove all that biomass and it does like totally foreclose on the potential secondary impacts to wildlife. It would be like increase like 100% nest failure. And there wouldn't be any residue left to benefit the wildlife. But again, I don't know that it seems to me that the community of birds taking advantage of at least these like monoculture cover crops that we see in the northern Corn Belt, I don't know that impact would be substantial just because we don't see a lot of use of those fields. It doesn't seem like there's like a lot of nests, for example, in a cover crop field at the time of termination.
All right, thanks. At the risk of running out of time, I've got one more thing I wanted to ask Adam. Could you expand a little bit more on the potential of just the overall adoption of cover crops in your region, providing like a source of, fields that are producing seed for cover crops in terms of their value?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and something that we've talked about. Like, we know that wildlife and grassland breeding birds, some species of wildlife and grassland breeding birds, including pheasants, use winter hardy grains. Like they will nest and pull off a nest often before harvest of say winter wheat. There's recent research in the Dakotas on that. And if you go back to like the 30s in Iowa, most pheasant nests were in like oats and rye and wheat and things like that, or many pheasant nests from those like earliest wildlife studies and after pheasants were released in Iowa. And so we do think that there's maybe like this market potential, like any markets for small grains that would diversify crop rotations in Iowa and provide a reason to grow, say, cereal rye to harvest, might have secondary positive impacts on grassland breeding birds. That would certainly be a positive. It would get you away from that challenge of planting and termination occurring during the early nesting season. And then I will just say, like, as we're wrapping up, like a really important takeaway for me personally is like wildlife need clean water. And so anything that promotes clean water, and cover crops are a really nice way of doing that in the annual cropping systems that prevail across the Corn Belt. Anything that promotes clean water stands to benefit wildlife, grassland birds among them. It's just that we're not finding a lot of like sort of secondary, like beyond the clean water benefits of cover crops for grassland breeding birds. And that's okay, because we also didn't find a lot of negative impacts either. And so finding ways to integrate diverse native perennial vegetation onto the margins of row crop fields, or in highly erodible areas in agricultural landscapes, or flood prone areas, or something like that, could be a way to for sure benefit grassland breeding birds. And then anything that cleans up the water is going to do right by wildlife in the aggregate, I think.
All right, thanks. That's a good way to end. Sort of, we need a more diverse ag landscape to support these birds. So we're at the top of the hour, so there's a whole lot more in the chat. Creech, I'm sure we could go for another hour, but I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap this up. Thanks.
Thank you all. Listen, I love to see it. This is fantastic. So thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for engaging. I also want to make sure I thank Mr. Ben Malone. Thank you, sir, if you're still with us on the call. Thank you so much for joining. So we'll go through a few things very quickly. I will not take much of your time. If you have to jump now, know that the one thing that I do want you to hear is please just visit our webpage, nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar, and that'll be in the chat as well. So everything I'm about to say you can find there. But a quick kind of closing, do want to flag that our additional resources one-pager is available on that webpage now, as is the sign-up link for you to receive direct Gov delivery emails. That's what I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. Also, our webinar recording and slides will be posted there no later than early May. So we usually say 2 weeks, but we can do a little quicker than that oftentimes. And there's a calendar tentatively planned throughout the calendar year, so throughout 2024. So please check that out. If you want to learn more about our Conservation Effects Assessment Project, which drives a good number of these webinars, please go to nrcs.usda.gov/CEAP. And we also have a specific web page for wildlife assessments. That will be in the chat. And please, I know we had a lot of questions we didn't get to. Feel free to email those to me directly, and we'll make sure we get back to you. Elizabeth.Creech-Thomas@usda.gov. That'll also be in the chat. We have 2 webinars coming up that we want to make sure you know about. One is next week. So our May webinar, we're kicking off American Wetlands Month with a webinar on mapping riverscapes to support productive and resilient working lands. That'll be next Thursday, May 2nd at 2:00 p.m. Eastern. This will have some implications for wildlife, so if that's a focus of yours, please plan to join us if you're able. We'll also make sure this one's recorded. And then June in Pollinator Month, June 20th at 2:00 p.m. Eastern, we have a webinar on, this will provide insights on how USDA supports pollinators and production agriculture across the nation. We'll hope you'll join us at both. That's all from me. Thank you, everyone. It's great to see this attendance, great to see this engagement. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you all.